Okay, so with our groove cut and our rabbet cut with the number 45, or I mean if you want to do that with a router table, table saw, whatever. Next thing is I'm going to be cutting half-blind dovetails. So the reasoning for half-blind dovetails instead of through dovetails is because of this groove. If we do through dovetails, you'll see this hole. And if we see that hole, then we're probably going to want to plug that hole. And instead of trying to match the grain and get that hole plugged in the end here, I figured if I just did half-blind dovetails, that'll hide it. So I just have to make sure that the tail ends up covering this. That way I know that it's going to be behind the half-blind part of the pin board. So let's see, what do we have? To lay out dovetails and stuff, and I should probably mention right away that I'm not saying this is the way to cut half-blind dovetails, or dovetails for that matter. This is just how I happen to do it. If you have another technique that works for you, or if you have something else that you want to try instead, by all means, have at it. I'm not saying this is a definitive way to do them. This is just one way that I've found that works. So with that in mind, you're going to want a couple of different chisels. I like having a really small chisel. This one is 1/4 of an inch. I also have my 3/8 inch chisel. This one is roughly the size of what I'm going to be using for the pins. And I also have a larger 3/4 inch chisel that is more useful for getting rid of most of the waste. I've also got a knife. This isn't my normal marking knife for everyday joinery, that'd be this one. But I actually prefer this knife a little bit because it's a little bit thinner, and for me it's a little bit easier to follow the dovetails with a knife like this rather than like my other marking knife. So I've got that. Pencil, I use that all the time for dovetails. I have a bevel here set to an arbitrary angle. I didn't measure this out or anything. I just simply took it, decided what I liked the look of, set it to that, that's it. I don't really care so much about the has to be 1 and 8 or it has to be no more than 6 degrees or whatever. I don't care. So set a bevel to whatever you want, use a dovetail marker. Doesn't matter to me what my angles are because I'm mainly just looking for what looks good, not necessarily what's the perfect ratio. And then I've also got my small square, a big square. I have a marking gauge, and this is set to the distance that rabbet was set to. So with this marking gauge, I also have it set out. So that's that distance, so I'll use that to mark around the ends. For the tails, I've got a set of dividers, and these dividers will be eventually used to step off the tailboard. And I have one last marking gauge, and that corresponds to the distance that I'll be setting the pin board for the thickness. So let's see. I think that pretty much covers it. Oh, sorry. One last thing. I have, well, a couple of last things. I have fret saw, dovetail saw, and mallets, but also I have a utility knife, and this is a decent quality one. I mean, technically it is a Chinese knockoff because it's a Master Force, but it's a pretty sturdy knife, and there's a lot of other ways that you can eliminate using this knife, but once I get into cutting the actual half-blind dovetails, you'll get to see what this is for. Now I think that's everything. So let's get to laying out my tailboard, and then I can start cutting those out. All right, so like I mentioned, I have my marking gauge set up, or one of my marking gauges set up for the distance of this rabbet here. So what I'm going to do is take that marking gauge, and I'm going to mark out across the end here And then I'm going to come the other way because I'm not left-handed, but I'm going to mark across this end here and then all the way across here. And if you have done normal dovetails before, this isn't any different. This is pretty much how you always start dovetails if you go tails first. And that's a whole debate that I'm not even going to get into. Tails first, pins first. Who cares as long as you get them cut, right? So I just prefer to do tails first, and realistically, tails first when you're doing half blinds I think is going to be a lot easier. But again, if you cut pins first somehow, cool. I've never actually tried tails first or pins first for half blinds, so if it works better than tails first, I'm missing out. Yeah, so I've marked out that, and then the next thing that I'm going to do is take my square, and I have everything set up to be a 1/2 inch off the edge. So if I set my square to 1/2 inch, come in from the edge 1/2 inch on both ends. So now I've got 1/2 inch there. Then I can take this and square that line across. On both pieces. And now is where it gets easier if you have a Moxon vise. So I have my Moxon vise set up here on my bench. It's a benchtop Moxon, and it's just a twin screw vise that I have clamped to my workbench, but I find it makes it a lot easier for dovetails and that kind of stuff, especially when you're working on longer pieces like this where a leg vise might not work. I find it to be a pretty good way to do stuff. So let me just reposition quick. Okay, so now that we have those pencil lines marked on there, I'm going to go ahead and use a knife just so I get the same mark everywhere. So I'm just marking straight across with the marking knife. Now it probably isn't critical since I'm going to be coming in here with a saw, but I always try, just out of habit, to make sure that I always cut on the correct side with that marking knife. So for example, here I cut on that side, and then here I cut on that side, and that's just so that if there's any bruising from the knife, I can get it on the side that I'm going to be cutting away anyway. So now I have my dividers set, and I start right in that line that I just made with the knife, make a little dent, and just kind of walk my way across, and then I start again on the other side by putting it in that opposite line, and then just do the exact same thing coming back the other direction. And I'm not going to go into detail about how to set up your marking or your dividers or anything like that. But it's a pretty common thing to use a set of dividers to lay out dovetails, especially if you're going to be doing more than one set. But that's not to say you have to. You could easily just eyeball it and cut them wherever you feel like, because honestly it doesn't matter. It's just whatever you're looking for. So if you're trying to go for a particular aesthetic where you want everything to be exactly the same, you're probably going to want to mark them out, but you know, it's up to you. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking my knife, putting it in that divot from the dividers rather, and I'm just pulling that across so I have a line that goes all the way across the end grain. So what I do is I set my knife in that little thing, move the bevel up to it or the square, and then mark across. Knife in the divot, square, mark across. Alright, so now I like to mark those with pencil as well, just to get a little bit darker of a line so I can see it a little bit better. Especially on some different kinds of woods too, like darker woods. It's sometimes difficult to, or more porous actually. Sometimes pine can be a pain, where it's a little bit more difficult to actually see those lines. It's especially nice to darken them. So now I take the bevel, set it on here. Make sure you have the bevel going the right direction whenever you're marking, but I put my knife in that line that I already marked, slide the bevel up to it, and then I just pull that line down to the marking gauge line that I ran earlier. And then you just kind of do that all the way across. And then this will be a guide for what you will be cutting to with your saw later. And these don't have to be perfect, because you could easily you know, just color these in or draw these in with pencil. You could also eyeball the angles. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it's up to you. I just like to do it because I like following the line. I like having something in a consistent uniformity, so to speak, from one side to the other. All right. Now that I've got that marked, I'm just gonna again run the pencil in them. Excellent. And then if you haven't done dovetails in a while, like me, or if you aren't used to knowing exactly which pieces to cut out, you might want to put an X on the various pieces that you'll be cutting out, just because that'll help keep track of which side of your line is waste and which side of your line isn't. And then we'll take the dovetail saw and start cutting them out.